The afternoon sun streamed through the lace curtains of the Bennett home, filling the living room with a soft golden light that made the decorations shimmer. Pink and blue balloons floated gently above, tied to chairs and gift tables, while a banner stretched across the wall with words of joy and expectation. Friends and family had arrived carrying gifts, wrapped in cheerful paper, their laughter and chatter blending with the clinking of glasses. To anyone who walked in, it was the perfect picture of a celebration, a long-awaited baby shower for a woman who had almost given up on the dream of becoming a mother. At 47, Clara Bennett radiated pride as she sat in the center of it all, opening gifts with delicate care and offering wide smiles to every guest. To those who knew her, Clara was a woman who deserved happiness. Her journey to motherhood had been long and painful, marked by miscarriages and quiet despair, yet she now seemed to stand at the threshold of the life she had always wanted. But beneath her graceful composure, Clara's heart pounded with a fear that none of her guests could see. She had perfected the art of hiding her true emotions, of maintaining the appearance of a devoted wife and soon-to-be mother. Richard, her husband of 20 years, stood by her side, quietly proud and protective. He was the kind of man who valued routine, stability, and loyalty. To the outside world, he and Clara were the model couple who had weathered storms and now stood united in joy. But Clara's smile masked a darker truth, one she had been hiding for nearly a year. Her secret began innocently, or at least she convinced herself it had. Loneliness had crept into her marriage, not because Richard was unkind, but because he was predictable, distant in ways he didn't even recognize. Clara, craving attention and excitement, found herself drawn to Michael, a younger man she met at the gym. What started with small conversations and harmless flirtation quickly evolved into something far more dangerous. Clara told herself she was simply enjoying a distraction, a spark of passion she hadn't felt in years. But Michael was persistent, and soon she was entangled in an affair she could neither fully control nor end. Every stolen moment with Michael thrilled her, but also filled her with guilt. Each time she returned home, she told herself she would stop, that she owed Richard honesty, that the affair was unsustainable. But the more she tried to pull away, the more Michael clung to her, whispering promises she didn't want to hear. Now, as she sat surrounded by family and friends at her baby shower, Clara's mind was half consumed with the fear that Michael might appear, that he might ruin everything with a single reckless outburst. The guests laughed and teased her as she opened a soft pink blanket, admiring its delicate embroidery. Cameras flashed, capturing her expression, her hands gently smoothing the fabric. Yet behind her glowing face was a woman terrified that her secret world was about to collapse. She glanced at Richard, who watched her with quiet affection, completely unaware of the betrayal lingering in the background of their lives. For him, this day was proof of his devotion, of the family they had built against all odds. For Clara, it was a fragile performance, one she prayed would not shatter before the last balloon deflated. Michael's absence at the party was both a relief and a torment. Clara wondered where he was, whether he was stewing in resentment, whether he might try to insert himself into the celebration she desperately wanted to preserve. His texts earlier that week had carried a tone of frustration, a demand for acknowledgement that she had brushed off. He wanted more than she could give, and she feared what might happen if he felt cornered. The decorations, the cake, the cheerful toasts, everything around Clara was meant to mark a new beginning, but in her mind, it all hung by a thread. Every laugh sounded too loud, every camera flash too sharp, as though the universe itself was mocking her charade. She played her part beautifully, graciously thanking each guest, posing for photos, and basking in the admiration of her community. Yet when she caught her reflection in the mirror across the room, she saw the truth, a woman exhausted from living two lives, a woman torn between the man who had given her stability and the man who had awakened her desire. As the evening drew on, the living room grew crowded with opened gifts, discarded wrapping paper, and the lingering warmth of celebration. Richard wrapped his arm around her, pressing a kiss to her forehead, a gesture that drew admiring sighs from their guests. Clara leaned into him, her smile unwavering, but her thoughts were far from the room. She could not silence the echo of Michael's words, the memory of his hands, the simmering threat in his voice when she last told him to stay away. The baby shower was supposed to be a milestone, a moment of untainted joy after years of struggle. Instead, it became a mask Clara wore, a fragile shell of happiness concealing the storm she had unleashed. No one at the party suspected that beneath the laughter and the pink ribbons lay the seeds of tragedy. Clara herself could not have imagined how soon the facade would crack, or how the man she feared might soon arrive to turn celebration into catastrophe. Michael sat alone in his small apartment on the morning of the baby shower, staring at the unread messages on his phone. The silence of the room was suffocating, broken only by the ticking of a clock that seemed to mock his restlessness. For months, he had been living in the shadows of Clara's life, hidden from the world, reduced to stolen hours and whispered conversations. At first he had accepted it. The thrill of secrecy had excited him, the idea of being chosen by a woman older, wiser and beautiful. But as the months passed, the thrill turned to bitterness. He wanted more. He wanted recognition. He wanted her to choose him over the husband she returned to night after night. The pregnancy complicated everything. Michael had convinced himself there was a chance the child was his, though Clara denied it each time he brought it up. The doubt clawed at his mind, twisting into an obsession. He pictured the child growing up under Richard's name, carrying his legacy, while he himself was erased, reduced to nothing more than a forgotten mistake. That thought ignited something in him that he couldn't control. The baby shower felt like a celebration of his erasure, a symbol of Clara moving on without him. As he dressed, his hands trembled, his anger boiled beneath the surface, but it was fueled by hurt more than hatred. He remembered the moments Clara had promised him she cared, the times she said he made her feel alive. Those memories tangled with the cold reality that she was choosing to hide him, to push him aside. By the time he left his apartment, he had already made a decision. He would no longer stay in the shadows. The Bennett home was bright and filled with laughter when he arrived. From the outside, the sound of joy spilled into the quiet suburban street. For a moment, he hesitated, standing on the sidewalk with his heart pounding. He knew he did not belong there, yet the thought of Clara celebrating without him, surrounded by people who believed in the perfect marriage she pretended to have, filled him with rage. He stepped forward, walking up the path, each step heavy with determination. Inside, Clara's world froze when she saw him at the door. Her chest tightened, her smile faltered, but she quickly composed herself as guests turned to look at the unexpected visitor. Richard, unaware of the tension, greeted him warmly, assuming he was a friend from work or the gym. Clara's stomach dropped, her worst fear unfolding in front of her. She had prayed he would stay away, but she could see in his eyes that he had come with purpose. Michael moved through the room with a calmness that belied the storm within him. He shook hands, exchanged polite nods, and accepted a drink as though he were part of the celebration. But his eyes never left Clara. She avoided his gaze, trying to distract herself with gifts and laughter. But every time she looked up, he was there, watching, reminding her of the truth she had buried. Guests whispered about how well he seemed to know her, though no one could quite place his connection. For Clara, every second felt like a countdown. She knew Michael too well, knew that his patience was thin, and his emotions unpredictable. She tried to control the situation with forced smiles and hurried glances, but it was useless. He lingered in the corners, biding his time, waiting for the right moment. The celebration, once so carefully arranged, had been poisoned by his presence. The decorations and cheerful music now felt like a stage set for disaster. Michael's thoughts spiraled as the party went on. He watched Clara laugh with her husband, watched Richard place an affectionate hand on her back, and felt invisible. To him, it was all a performance, a lie she had chosen over him. Each gesture between the couple cut into him like a blade. He believed he had given Clara a passion she could never find in her marriage, and now she was pretending he didn't exist. His resentment grew heavier, pressing against the fragile control he held. By the time the cake was brought out, and the cameras began to flash, Michael's resolve had hardened. He would not leave that house as a forgotten secret. If Clara would not acknowledge him willingly, he would force the truth into the open. In his mind, it wasn't revenge. It was justice, the right to be seen for what he believed he was, the man who truly mattered in her life. The celebration was reaching its peak, but for Michael, it was only the beginning of the unraveling he was determined to set in motion. The atmosphere inside the Bennett home was still buzzing with joy when the knife sliced into the baby shower cake. Cameras flashed, guests leaned forward with excitement, and Clara tried her best to keep her trembling hands steady as she served each piece. For a moment, she almost believed she had made it through the day without disaster, that Michael's presence was just a passing threat. But as he watched her hand a plate of cake to Richard, his composure cracked. The sight of the two of them together, smiling for the cameras, ignited the anger he had been holding back. The murmur of cheerful conversation was interrupted when Michael cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. At first, no one understood. His tone was calm, but the words that followed shattered the illusion of celebration. He spoke directly, naming himself as Clara's lover, claiming they had been together for months. The room fell silent, the laughter evaporating into stunned disbelief. Forks clattered onto plates, and the chatter of children in the corner died away. The only sound was Michael's steady, bitter voice as he detailed the affair in front of the entire room. Clara's face drained of color, her eyes wide with horror. She wanted to stop him, to silence him, but she could barely breathe. Richard stood frozen beside her, the plate in his hand forgotten, his gaze shifting between his wife and the man who had just upended his world. Guests exchanged shocked glances, some covering their mouths in disbelief, others staring openly, waiting for someone to deny the accusation. But Michael continued, offering details so specific that there was no doubt he was telling the truth. The air grew heavy, thick with tension. Clara tried to speak, to offer some explanation, but the weight of his words hung too heavily in the room. Every pair of eyes bore into her, friends and relatives who had come to celebrate, now looking at her as though they no longer knew her. Richard's silence was worse than anger. His face remained unreadable, but the stiffness in his posture betrayed the storm inside him. Michael's voice wavered as he spoke, his bitterness seeping into every word. He insisted that the child might even be his, a claim that sent a ripple of whispers through the crowd. Clara's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table, fighting the urge to collapse. The humiliation was unbearable, but the fear in her chest was sharper still. She knew what this revelation could do to Richard, a man who valued loyalty and trust above all else. The party unraveled in an instant. Guests who had been smiling moments before now gathered their things, their faces pale, their eyes avoiding Clara's. Some muttered excuses as they hurried out, others lingered awkwardly, unsure whether to comfort her or simply flee from the chaos. The cheerful decorations, the carefully arranged gifts, the bright banner on the wall, all of it seemed grotesque now, mocking the family portrait that had been destroyed. Richard finally set the plate down with slow precision, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on Clara. He said nothing, but his silence spoke louder than any outburst. Clara reached for him, but he recoiled as though her touch might burn him. That single movement cut deeper than any words could. Michael stood off to the side, breathing heavily, his outburst complete. He had achieved what he wanted: exposure, acknowledgement, and destruction of the illusion Clara had built. As more guests slipped out, the once lively house grew quieter, the tension pressing down like a weight. Clara could feel her life unraveling thread by thread, every relationship, every bond, slipping away in the silence that followed Michael's confession. She had tried so hard to balance two worlds, but now both had collided in the most public, humiliating way possible. The baby shower that had begun as a symbol of new life, and hope had turned into a stage for betrayal. Clara's secret was no longer hers to bear, and the man she feared had ensured there was no turning back. She looked at Richard, at the guests who still lingered, at the decorations that mocked her with their cheer, and realized the truth: nothing would ever be the same again. The house was silent after the last of the guests left. Wrapping paper still littered the floor, balloons sagged in the corners, and the half-eaten cake sat untouched on the table. Clara walked through the living room in a daze, her steps slow, her hands shaking as she gathered stray cups and plates. Every sound echoed louder than it should have: the clinking of dishes, the soft rustle of her dress. The warmth of celebration had vanished, replaced by an emptiness that clung to every corner of the house. Upstairs, Richard remained shut in their bedroom. He had gone there without a word, his face blank, his eyes dark with thoughts he hadn't shared. Clara tried to convince herself he only needed time. She had seen him angry before, but never like this, never with such silence. She walked into the nursery, the small room freshly painted, and filled with tiny clothes neatly folded in drawers. She sat in the rocking chair, her hand resting on her stomach, as though holding onto the child might shield her from the collapse of everything else. The joy she had felt earlier that day seemed like a cruel trick. What was meant to be the beginning of a new chapter had instead exposed the darkest part of her life. Down the hall, Richard stood in front of the mirror, his reflection a stranger. He replayed Michael's words over and over, each detail like a knife in his chest. The betrayal was unbearable, not just because of the affair itself, but because of the public humiliation. Their friends, their family, the entire community now knew that the marriage he had worked so hard to preserve was a lie. He thought about the years of sacrifices, the nights spent comforting Clara after their losses, the patience he had shown when they thought parenthood might never be theirs. All of it, he now believed, had been mocked by her secret. When he finally left the bedroom, his face was calm, almost too calm. He found Clara in the nursery, her body still, her eyes staring at the tiny crib as though searching for an answer. She looked up at him, her lips parting to speak, but no words came. The silence between them was suffocating. Richard's hands trembled as he stepped inside, his chest heaving with emotions too heavy to contain. For a moment, it seemed as though he might turn and walk away, retreat back into his solitude. But something in him had already broken beyond repair. Clara whispered his name, her voice fragile, but it only deepened the ache inside him. To him, the nursery represented hope, trust, and the future they had planned together. Now it felt tainted, a cruel reminder of the family he believed had been built on lies. Rage swelled within him, but it wasn't loud. It was quiet, suffocating, like a tide that had been rising too long. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her as she clutched her stomach. The fear in her eyes was clear, and in that instant, he saw her not as his wife, but as the source of his ruin. The confrontation escalated without words. Clara tried to stand, her hands raised as though to calm him, but his fury erupted in a sudden, violent act. The rocking chair tipped, the folded clothes scattered, and the peaceful nursery became the setting of unspeakable horror. The walls, once painted with tender care, bore witness to a tragedy that no one in the quiet neighborhood could have imagined. Clara's cries were brief, swallowed by the force of Richard's rage, and within moments the room fell silent again. When it was over, Richard stood frozen, staring at what he had done. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, his hands stained by his own violence. The crib beside him seemed to glow in the dim light, a cruel reminder of the innocence that had been lost. He sank to his knees, overcome not by relief, but by an emptiness deeper than any despair he had ever known. The life he had shared with Clara, the family they had tried to build, the reputation he had cherished, everything was gone in a single, irreversible act. The nursery, once a place of hope, now held only shadows and silence. Outside, the remnants of the baby shower still lingered, colorful decorations swaying gently in the evening air, mocking the destruction that had unfolded inside. Richard knew there was no turning back, no way to undo the violence that had consumed him. The house that had once been filled with laughter and promise was now a tomb of secrets, betrayal, and a love story that ended in tragedy. The next morning, the quiet street outside the Bennett home seemed untouched by the tragedy that had unfolded inside. Neighbors went about their routines, unaware that the once celebratory house was now cloaked in silence. Curtains were drawn, and the balloons that had swayed in the breeze the night before hung limply, their colors faded against the pale dawn. It was only when Richard failed to show up for work that calls began to circulate. He was known for his punctuality, a man who followed routines as precisely as clockwork. When hours passed with no answer, concern grew. A neighbor, noticing the stillness of the house, finally called the police. Officers arrived just after midday, knocking on the door with no response. The house appeared locked, but something felt wrong. Through a window, one officer saw the remains of the party, plates left out, decorations drooping, the scene frozen in time. Once they forced their way in, the air inside was heavy, still carrying the faint scent of food and flowers. They moved cautiously, the sound of their footsteps echoing unnaturally in the emptiness. Upstairs, the nursery door was ajar. When they entered, the grim reality revealed itself. Clara lay lifeless on the floor beside the crib, her body broken by the violence of the night before. The small room, painted with tenderness and filled with baby clothes, had become the scene of her final moments. The officers stood in silence for a long time, the horror of what they were witnessing sinking in slowly. What should have been a space of innocence and hope now bore the mark of unspeakable loss. The search for Richard began immediately. Investigators pieced together the events of the previous evening from the guests who had been at the shower. They spoke of Michael's sudden appearance, his shocking accusations, the stunned silence that followed. The story formed a picture of a man pushed to the edge by betrayal, humiliation, and rage. But where Richard had gone after the violence was still unknown. Hours later, his car was discovered parked near a wooded area just outside of town. Inside, officers found him slumped against the seat, lifeless, a handgun resting near his hand. The note he left behind was short, written in shaky letters. It spoke of betrayal, humiliation, and a love that had curdled into hatred. He claimed he could not live with the shame, and could not imagine raising a child who might not be his. His words carried bitterness, but beneath them was an unmistakable despair. News of the tragedy spread quickly. Neighbors who had celebrated at the shower just a day before struggled to process the reality. They remembered Clara's forced smiles, the tension in her eyes, details they had brushed off in the excitement of the celebration. Now those details took on new meaning, clues they wished they had recognized before it was too late. The community, once united in joy, was left haunted by the darkness that had unfolded in their midst. Michael was questioned but released soon after, his role in the chain of events undeniable, but not criminal. His confession at the shower had been the spark that ignited the final act, but the violence had been Richard's choice alone. Still, many whispered about his responsibility, blaming him for dragging secrets into the light, without care for the destruction they would cause. He carried the weight of that guilt, retreating from public view as the community's judgment pressed down on him. The Bennett house stood empty for weeks, its cheerful decorations removed, its windows boarded. For those who passed by, it became a symbol of fragility, of how quickly love and trust could dissolve into violence. Parents warned their children not to linger near it, while others crossed the street to avoid looking at the home that had hosted both joy and horror in such a short span of time. Clara's funeral was small, attended by those who still remembered her as a woman full of warmth before her secrets came to light. Richard was buried separately, the two graves standing as a bitter reminder of how their love had ended. The unborn child, never given a chance to enter the world, became the quietest victim of all. In the months that followed, people continued to talk about the tragedy, replaying the details as though searching for an answer. Some blamed Clara for her choices, Others blamed Richard for his violence, and still others blamed Michael for his reckless confession. But beneath the speculation was a common understanding: the baby shower, once a day of celebration, had revealed how fragile happiness can be. Behind closed doors, even the most perfect lives could hide secrets capable of tearing everything apart.